Hello guys, my name is Khan, and in today's video I will show you guys that how you can create a macro about the pivot tables. So in the start of the video, for those users, those who don't know what is the pivot table, I also give a bit introduction. So this is the Excel file that I will be using for this video. So if you go to sheet 1, I have a bit hypothetical data about car make, what are the prices, how much MPG they have, weight, and some other variable. And then we have a variable which is foreign, which is telling us that the car is domestic or foreign. We have a bit 75 rows of data, not much big. So suppose if you want to create a pivot table, you can create a pivot table within the Excel sheet where you have the data to. But I usually prefer to insert pivot table in a separate sheet. So suppose if I select any random cell here and then I go to insert, and under the insert I have the first option which is pivot table. So if I click it, so the first it is asking me to select the data based on which you want to create your table. So I will select this button and go to sheet 1, and in sheet 1 I have from row A to column A till column L is all the data that I have. I selected it, and now it's also telling me that where it will place my pivot table. So by default it have selected sheet 2B2, which is the cell that I have selected before starting inserting the table. So I will say okay. So now when I have done it, you can see that my variable, all the variables from my data are appearing on the right on this window. So what actually Excel did is that Excel assumed that the first row of my data is my variable names. So and those variable names are appearing here. So suppose if I want to create a table and I want to see how things vary over domestic or foreign, so I will select this variable. It automatically have added it here. I also want it here, but I also want to see that how weight of the car varies among domestic and foreign car. So I will drag it to values, and in the same way I drag the length to the values, and you can see as I am adding those variables, the pivot table keeps on adding the sum of weight and sum of length, and in the same way I can also add the third variable here. But the point is that you don't want to see the sum of it. Probably you will be looking for average weight among domestic and foreign. And if you want to change the statistics, so it's very easy. You go to down arrow button, and in the down arrow button we have value field settings. In the value field setting we have different values available. You can also select this option too, but here suppose if I want to select average, and once I selected, my label got updated to average of weight. In the same way I can also change the sum of turn to average of turn. Again I will select here, and in the same way last one, suppose sum of length, I will come here, and you can select whatever you want. Suppose you want to see the minimum, so you can also select that. So in this table I have minimum of length variable, average of turn variable, and average of weight variable. So I have created a pivot table in Excel. But suppose if you want to do the same thing with the help of VBA, so instead of repeating these steps again and again, and suppose you create a macro of your pivot table and you can apply that macro in multiple other workbooks or within your workbook on multiple other sheets which have the similar data. So then how you can do it? I think the best way is to, in order to create a VBA macro for pivot table, it's better that first you record the macro, because then you don't have to memorize the syntax. You can then, once you record the macro, then you can make that macro more readable to you. What does it mean by readable? Because when you usually record the macro, the VBA store that macro in a very machine language way, which is sometimes very hard to understand that what actually that macro is doing. So before going further, when you ever create a pivot table, the Excel automatically give that pivot table a name. So in order to see what's the name of that pivot table, if I go within, if you can see the pivot table, and I'm under Analyze tab, so you can see that the pivot table name by default is given by pivot table 1. You can even change that table first step. So if I click it, now if I again go to my table, now you can see that my pivot table name is first. So you can change it if you want. But this pivot table name will be used in the VBA macro too. So before going forward, what I will do, I will just delete this sheet and I will insert another sheet. Now what I will do, I will start recording the macro for the pivot table. So in order to do that, first I will go to Developer tab, and then I will go to Record Macro, and then I will be naming it as pivot. You can name it whatever you want, record it. Okay, so this store macro will be in this workbook. Okay, and now I can do work. So what I will do first, I'll go to, first I will select suppose A1, then I will be say insert, and then I will say pivot table. In the pivot table again I will select the table array, and I will select all the columns A till L, and then okay, I want the location to be sheet to A1. That's fine. Okay, and now what I will do, I will add the variable in the same way I did it before into the rows. Then I will add weight, length, and turn, and I will change the stats from sum to average of length. As you can say that my custom name will be average of length, which will also appear as a header. Okay, and then I will change for sum of turn as a minimum. Okay, and then in the same way sum of weight to maximum source. So now I have created this table, and now if I go to my developer tab, I can stop recording. So my macro got saved, but before going forward, this table actually is about that how different variables behave. These three variables behave for domestic and foreign cars. So overall, I have this table. Now if I go to my Visual Basic to see that how VBA have recorded this macro, so I will first minimize some other files that I already have. So I will go to module 1, which have my recorded macro. So apparently it seems very there is a lot of code just in front of you. But I think if once you go one by one, you will realize that it's not something difficult. You can easily comprehend it. So what I will do, first I will go through this code, and then I will tell you that you can even copy this macro or change this macro according to your own needs. So how you can or make it more readable to yourself. So when you next time come to this macro, you can see that how you can make it more readable. So firstly, you can see that this macro recorded as a pivot recorded. Then it tell us that because it's going into the active sheet, which is the sheet 2 right now, and then it say that select the range 1, A1, and then it says that active workbook pivot cache. Actually, pivot cache allows you to that what from where you will be getting your source data and what will be the pivot name. So as you can see, this function, which is starting afterwards with brackets, we are telling that source type where the data is coming from Excel database. We can even get the data from different database, but for this example I am getting from Excel database. And then it's saying that source data is equal to sheet 1, and then sheet 1 is saying row 1, starting from row 1. Actually it's just a range selector in a machine language way. I will let you know how you can change it. So from row 1 C1, row 1 C1 means A1, and then till the maximum column we have, and then it have some version 6. Then it's saying that dot, so this function, the cache create function, ends at this bracket. Then we are saying dot create. Actually pivot cache create, we created a data source for our pivot table, and then we are saying create pivot table, and then after creating pivot table we are saying where we have to place that table, which is in sheet 2 row A1, row 1 column 1, which is actually A1 cell. And then we are giving table 2 name. We can alter this table name to whatever, maybe VBA pivot table, whatever you like. And then again it's giving some default version 6. And then we are saying sheets 2.select, because we are going to place our pivot table on sheet 2. The cells 1 to 1 got selected, and then what it's doing is that if I press enter, so under the active workbook show pivot table field is equal to true, which means that if I will let you know that if you go make it false, if you remember, if I go to this design, so analyze, so the field list, if it's true, it means they show us these values. And then we have that with active sheet pivot table, which is pivot 2, it's asking for the foreign variable, and then defining some orientation, which is Excel row field, and then position is equal to 1, which is I think center or the left line. And then it's saying end width. So actually width function is attaching this part of the row in start of every of these dot orientation dot position. And then what we are doing is that another thing now started, that within the active sheet pivot table 2, then we are adding the field into our pivot table, which is the named as pivot table 2. The field which we are adding is the weight, and we are saying that label that field as a sum of weight. So you can even change that thing too. So suppose if I want to change it to actually I will change it to my own macro. In the same way, we have added another row. Now we are saying get the sum of length and put the function Excel of sum. But the other thing is not that later I change these things to sum to average. So this thing is again the same thing again on the return variable. And now what you can see that I changed these statistics and altered from default. So once I altered from default, I said that for sum of length, make it caption is equal to average of length, and then also perform the function of average. And in the same way, I did for the sum of turn, and I did the same here. And I also altered, because now I'm using the minimum for this variable, and then I use the maximum for weight variable. So now what can I do that I will show you guys that suppose if you want to make this code more readable, how you can do this. So what I will do is I think the main function which is less readable is this part where we are defining the pivot cache. So what I'll do, I will just turn this thing into comments so that I will start writing my own. So first I will copy these comments and I will alter it in a way so that these things will become more readable. So we are in the active workbook.pivotcache.create. Actually, as I told before, that pivot cache is actually allows us to select our source data from where we will based on which we will construct our pivot table. And then it's saying that the source type is actually coming from the Excel database, because we have selected the data from our Excel sheet. And then we are having here is the source data. So you can select this thing so you can change that thing to be more readable. So what I will be doing is that I will, instead of this, I will say dot range, and then I will say start from A1 till, if I go back to my Excel, actually it's L75. I go back to my L75, sorry, L75. So now I have selected the range. So suppose if I run this macro, but I also have to specify the sheet. It's coming from sheet 1. So I have specified the sheet, I have specified the range. So now let's see, if I delete my macro, this table, so and insert it again by running this macro, hopefully this macro will run fine. See, I'm getting an error. So guys, I checked that why I'm getting an error, because when I'm trying to alter my code according to me, so then there is no need to read this source type dot the colon equal. So I have removed all these things from my line, and then you can see that my code become more concise. So now I'm saying pivot cache dot create, and then after that I'm mentioning the database name. So the first argument will be automatically the database. Then I'm saying where worksheet sheet 1, and it's coming here. And then I'm also telling that where what will the create pivot table, and then I'm saying where we have to create, what will be the starting from which range, and then what will be the pivot table name. It's a very important thing that make sure that if you change the pivot table name here, then you have to change the pivot table name in all the respective cells coming below, or in the respective code coming below, because otherwise VBA will not be able to realize that where are you want to make change. Another thing, important thing is to note here is that you can make your pivot tables more dynamic. So what does it mean by dynamic? Because here we are selecting the range, very fixed range, A1 to L75. So if I go back to my data, which is, so first I will run this code, and you can see that pivot table got created now with the help of your own altered VBA macro code. And now let's see if I delete it again, and if I go to sheet 1, sorry, and suppose there is someone who added some row into your data. So my last row is 75. So let's say if I add some hypothetical data, I just copy paste it here, copy this line. Now my data is ending at row number 76, and suppose I also change this category, I add a new category now, suppose international, just saying that international. And now, but if I run my code, you will not be able to see this new category because my range is very fixed. So let's see if I run it, go back, you can see that my VBA is not showing me the international category here, which I have just created. So in order to make your VBA, in order to keep your pivot tables dynamic, so if the data change, your pivot table also change, there is a very useful option instead of giving the fixed range, better to give, suppose, a range like A1, any cell from that data range, and then I will be saying dot current region. Now if I run this code, first I will delete this pivot table. Otherwise, suppose if I run this, so it will say that I will get an error. So first I will delete this table. I'm having some syntax error now. Let me check it again. Sorry, actually I missed the bracket. That's why I was getting an error. So here there must be a bracket to close this function, which is the pivot cache.create function. Now let's see if I run it. So now I'm having a current region. I've used the functionality of current region I've used here. So now it's if you use it, and if I go to my Excel sheet, now you can see that even the international categories here. In the same way, if I go back now, and again if I create another category, Control C, Control V, and now I'm saying third cat, just giving a name. So I would like to show that now if I go back, I don't need to alter my code now. What I need to know is that so suppose if I run this code now, it's getting me an error because the object is already defined. So I will say end. Why? Because the pivot table that I am creating is already created here. If I show you this, so if I come here, if I select this table, if I go to analyze, and let's see, the pivot table 2 is here. So suppose if you want to create another pivot table, so there it's better to change the pivot table name. So what I will do, I will select this pivot table 2, I will say Control H, and I will replace pivot table 2 with table 3, and I will say replace all. So it have done this replacement for me. I will close it. So now, Control H and replace with 3. Replace all. Okay, and now you can see we have pivot table 3 everywhere. But in the same way, I will, in order to where I have to paste, so at this time I will say E1, where to create that region, because I don't want to overlap with my existing pivot table. Now let's see if I run it. Sorry, actually I have to write down E1 where I want to create my pivot table. And now let's see if I run it now. First I have already executed it, so I will delete this new pivot table. And now let's see if I go back. Now if I run it, you can see that a pivot table is created here. So in this video, what I have discussed with you guys, that how you can create pivot tables with the help of macro, and within that, once you recorded the macro, you can make it more readable by altering that macro. And the most important thing is that use this current region option, because even if you see that I have updated my data third time, now I have 4 categories here. So every time when I'm running the macro, my pivot table got updated according to the latest data, and therefore I will insist a lot to use this current region. And this option usually makes your macros very dynamic. So that's all for today's video. Thank you for watching the video.